You're driving the way you always have. Same habits, same instincts. You stop where you're supposed to stop. You signal when it feels necessary. You follow what you believe are the rules. And yet, right now, without realizing it, you could already be breaking a law that didn't exist just a short time ago. Not because you're careless, not because you're reckless, but because the rules quietly changed, and most drivers never got the message. So let me ask you something, and I want you to answer this in the comments. Do you believe you're fully up to date on the latest driving laws? Or are you still relying on what you learned years ago? Think about that carefully, because this is exactly where the problem begins. Traffic laws don't always change in ways that make headlines. Many updates happen at the state level. They are written into revised statutes, adjusted through regulatory agencies, or clarified through court decisions. And while they may seem small on paper, they can have very real consequences the moment you're on the road. What we're seeing in 2026 is not one single sweeping federal law, but a collection of state-level changes and enforcement shifts that together are reshaping how driving is regulated in the United States. In my legal analysis, this is part of a broader evolution in traffic law, moving from simple rule enforcement to behavior-based regulation. In other words, it's no longer just about what you do. It's about how your driving affects the entire traffic environment. Historically, traffic laws were built on clear, objective standards: speed limits, stop signs, lane markings. These were easy to understand and relatively easy to enforce. But as roads became more complex and traffic density increased, lawmakers began introducing broader legal language, terms like reasonable, prudent, and safe operation. That shift matters because it gives law enforcement more discretion, and it places more responsibility on drivers to interpret situations correctly. Now let's connect this to constitutional principles. Under the Fourth Amendment, any traffic stop must be based on reasonable suspicion that a law has been violated. That means even minor infractions, things many drivers wouldn't think twice about, can legally justify a stop. Courts would likely examine whether the officer had a specific, articulable reason for initiating the stop. And with these newer laws, that threshold can be met in ways that surprise drivers. Take, for example, updated lane usage rules that are being enforced more aggressively in several states. Driving in the left lane without actively passing is no longer treated as a minor inconvenience. In some jurisdictions, it's now a primary enforcement focus. In my legal analysis, this reflects a growing emphasis on traffic flow efficiency rather than just individual compliance. There is a strong constitutional argument that as long as the law is clearly defined and applied consistently, these enforcement practices fall within acceptable limits. But it also means drivers must adjust their habits, because what was once tolerated may now result in a citation. Another area seeing significant change involves distracted driving laws. While many states already prohibited texting while driving, newer regulations are expanding the definition of device use. Holding a phone at all, even momentarily, can now be considered a violation in certain jurisdictions. Courts would likely examine whether these laws are overly broad or whether they serve a legitimate public safety interest. So far, the trend suggests that courts are generally supportive of stricter distracted driving regulations. From a real-world perspective, this means drivers must be more intentional about how they interact with technology behind the wheel. Now consider speed-related enforcement. In some areas, driving significantly below the speed limit, if it disrupts traffic flow, can now be treated as a violation. This surprises many drivers who assume that slower always means safer. In my legal analysis, this change reflects a shift toward balancing individual caution with collective efficiency. And while the intent is safety, the application can create confusion. Now let's talk about how these changes intersect with the Fifth Amendment. During a traffic stop, drivers are required to provide identification and basic documentation. But they are not required to answer questions that could be self-incriminating. The challenge is that many drivers don't know where that line is. They talk too much. They explain unnecessarily. They assume cooperation means answering everything. It doesn't. Controlled, respectful communication is key. Now let's bring in the Second Amendment dimension, because this is where things become even more nuanced. For lawful gun owners, traffic stops have always carried an additional layer of responsibility. And with evolving driving laws increasing the likelihood of stops, these interactions are becoming more frequent. State laws vary widely when it comes to firearm disclosure. Some require immediate notification to law enforcement. Others do not. If a stop occurs under one of these updated driving laws and a firearm is present, the legal focus can quickly expand. In my legal analysis, compliance with both traffic laws and firearm regulations becomes critical in these moments. There is a strong constitutional argument that lawful possession should not create suspicion. However, courts also recognize officer safety considerations. Courts would likely examine whether the driver followed all applicable laws and whether the officer acted within constitutional limits. Now consider federal versus state authority. Traffic laws are primarily state-driven. That means each state can implement its own rules, enforcement priorities, and penalties. However, constitutional protections, such as those under the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, apply nationwide. This creates a system where the rules may change depending on where you are, but your fundamental rights remain the same. That combination can be difficult to navigate, and that's exactly why so many drivers are caught off guard. Let's talk about real-world impact. A driver who casually uses their phone at a red light may now be violating a hands-free law. A driver who stays in the left lane too long may now be subject to a citation. A driver who assumes slower speed equals compliance may actually be disrupting traffic flow and attracting enforcement attention. These are not extreme scenarios. They are everyday situations, and the legal consequences are real. Fines, points on your license, increased insurance costs. In some cases, repeated violations can lead to more serious penalties. Now let's address the political reality. Most of these changes are not controversial in the traditional sense. They are framed around safety, efficiency, and modernization of traffic systems. Supporters argue that stricter and more adaptive laws reduce accidents, improve traffic flow, and reflect the realities of modern driving. And there is validity in that argument. However, critics raise concerns about over-enforcement and the potential for vague legal standards to be applied inconsistently. In my legal analysis, this tension is inevitable. As laws become more flexible, enforcement becomes more subjective, and that creates both opportunities for improved safety and risks of uneven application. Courts would likely continue to play a central role in defining the boundaries of these laws. Looking ahead, the long-term implications are clear. Driving is becoming more regulated, not less. Technology will continue to influence enforcement. Data will play a larger role. And legal standards will continue to evolve. Drivers who stay informed will adapt. Drivers who rely on outdated assumptions will face increasing risk. Because the reality is simple. The law doesn't wait for you to catch up. It applies the moment you're on the road. So the question becomes, are you driving based on what the law is today, or what you think it used to be? If this opened your eyes to how much has changed, subscribe for more clear, real-world legal breakdowns that actually affect your daily life. And share your perspective in the comments, because understanding these changes starts with conversations like this. Know the law before it knows you.